Good evening. If you can hear this voice, it means you've chosen to walk through the quiet part of history, the one most people avoid. Tonight, we travel to a place where the snow never melted, where science forgot mercy, and where silence became the loudest sound. This is the story of Unit 731, Japan's secret biological warfare program during the Second World War. It was called a research facility. It was presented as a laboratory for health and sanitation. In truth, it was a factory of death hidden behind white coats and data sheets. But this will not be a story of horror for shock's sake. It will be told slowly, calmly, as it happened. Because the true cruelty of Unit 731 was not in its noise, but in its quiet, in the way men carried clipboards instead of guns, and the wind outside covered the screams. Before we begin, if you find meaning in these quiet retellings, in hearing the past as it really was, consider subscribing. It helps this history remain alive, even when it hurts to look at it. And perhaps, leave a comment, not of fear, but of remembrance. Now, close your eyes. Imagine a cold plain in northern China, Manchuria, 1936. The air smells of frost and coal smoke. Snow drifts over train tracks that lead to a small compound outside the city of Harbin. There is no sound but the whine of the wind and the creak of wooden gates. Inside those gates, men in surgical masks walk through white corridors, carrying papers that say nothing about what is really happening there. The name on the sign is Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwangtung Army. A harmless name, a perfect disguise. But behind those doors, something begins that the world will not believe for decades. A new kind of warfare, and a new definition of silence. The world was still recovering from the last Great War when Japan began preparing for the next one. The 1930s opened with silence and hunger. The Great Depression spread like a shadow, and across the islands of Japan, rice prices fell, factories closed, and young men stared at empty futures. The military promised them purpose. It promised glory, expansion, and food. Across the sea lay Manchuria, vast, cold, and rich. Coal, iron, timber, and land enough to feed a starving empire. For Tokyo's generals, it was the answer to everything: space, resources, and pride. In 1931, under the pretext of a staged railway explosion, the Mukden incident, Japan invaded Manchuria. Within months, the Kwangtung Army controlled the region. They created a puppet state called Manchukuo, with a new flag, a new anthem, and an old emperor, Pui, the last ruler of China's fallen Qing dynasty. On paper, it was a sovereign nation. In truth, it was a colony built on steel and obedience. Japanese engineers arrived with blueprints, soldiers with bayonets, bureaucrats with ledgers. Towns grew around railway lines, mines opened. The land, which had belonged to farmers for centuries, now belonged to the empire. Alongside the soldiers came doctors, not healers, not yet monsters, simply doctors of the Imperial Japanese Army. Among them was Ishii, a brilliant, restless man in his late 30s. He had studied medicine at Kyoto Imperial University and had become obsessed with one idea: that bacteria, invisible and unstoppable, could be used as weapons. In the laboratories of Tokyo, Ishii had read about Western experiments with biological warfare, anthrax in Britain, plague research in France. To him, it was the science of the future, a weapon that could kill silently, efficiently, cheaply. A weapon that could level empires without bullets. He began to lecture to military officers, arguing that Japan needed to master this art before anyone else. His superiors listened. Japan was expanding. The army needed every possible advantage. Ishii's confidence, his cleverness, his devotion to national health made him persuasive. He spoke the language of progress. He wrapped horror in the language of hygiene. He promised that he could create weapons that would make Japan untouchable. By 1932, the Kwangtung Army had given him what he wanted: land, money, and secrecy. They built his first laboratory in Harbin, a city under Japanese control. Officially, it was part of the Epidemic Prevention Department. The mission sounded noble. Its real purpose was written in invisible ink. The early years were quiet. The buildings looked harmless, low brick structures with white walls and clean windows. Inside, the staff wore surgical masks and white coats. Outside, guards patrolled the perimeter with rifles. Ishii tested equipment, autoclaves, incubators, glass flasks for growing bacteria. They began small, breeding fleas, studying cholera and anthrax cultures. He called his early experiments scientific hygiene. His reports to Tokyo spoke of environmental studies and water purification methods. But between the lines was a different story. Prisoners began arriving, accused spies, dissidents, villagers caught in raids. They were called maruta, logs. It was a word that turned people into objects. It made cruelty sound like labor. Each day, the snow drifted across the compound, muffling sound. Each night, smoke rose from chimneys. The guards were told they were defending Japan's medical frontier. The scientists were told they were advancing humanity. The prisoners were told nothing at all. By 1933, Ishii's work had outgrown its first home. His reputation within the army grew with it. The generals saw potential, not only for war, but for prestige. They believed biological research could make Japan equal to the Western powers that had once humiliated it. Ishii promised results, and the military gave him everything he asked for: new buildings, more staff, more prisoners. Harbin became the heart of a growing empire of laboratories. Beneath its snow-covered roofs, science turned cold. The doctors no longer saw patients, they saw data points. The line between healing and killing blurred until it disappeared entirely. Outside the compound, the world continued as if nothing was happening. Farmers worked the frozen fields, trains carried coal and soldiers north. The propaganda spoke of Japan's noble mission to bring modernity, sanitation, and order to Asia. Ishii smiled when he heard those words. They sounded just like his reports. The seeds had been planted. An empire of disease, a kingdom of control. It would take years for the world to learn its name. Unit 731. Shirishi was born on June 25, 1892, in Chiyoda Village, Chiba Prefecture, Japan. He studied medicine at Kyoto Imperial University, graduating in 1920. After joining the Imperial Japanese Army, he specialized in microbiology and was assigned to the Army Medical School in Tokyo. There, he began promoting the concept of biological warfare as a strategic advantage. Between 1928 and 1930, Ishii toured Europe and the United States to study water purification and epidemic control. During that trip, he visited institutions in France, Germany, and the U.S. Army's Biological Research Center at Fort Detrick. Although no evidence shows direct access to secret information, Ishii returned convinced that major powers were secretly developing biological weapons. After Japan's occupation of Manchuria in 1931, Ishii proposed creating a new military research unit dedicated to epidemic prevention. His plan received support from General Shikoizumi, head of the Army Medical College, and later from General Yoshijiro Umezu of the Kwantung Army. In 1932, Ishii established a small facility as the Togo unit near Harbin, operating under the cover name the Epidemic Prevention Department of the Kwantung Army. The site's official mission was to research water purification, but its real purpose was the cultivation and testing of pathogens, including cholera, anthrax, plague, and typhus. The staff expanded rapidly. By 1933, the facility had approximately 150 personnel, physicians, biologists, veterinarians, and military police. Prisoners were supplied by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, who arrested Chinese civilians accused of espionage or resistance. These prisoners were referred to internally as maruta logs, a euphemism used to conceal human experimentation in reports and conversations. In 1934, a plague outbreak near the Beijing facility exposed the risks of Ishii's operations. Several staff members died, and the local population became suspicious. The Japanese military ordered the lab dismantled and relocated farther from civilian centers. Ishii was not punished. Instead, he was promoted. His ability to persuade higher officers and present his work as patriotic and scientific secured him protection and additional funding. In 1936, the Kwantung Army authorized the construction of a new and significantly larger complex south of Harbin, in an area called Pingfang. The project was approved under the title Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, later designated Unit 731. Construction began the same year under military supervision. The Pingfang complex covered approximately 6 square kilometers. It included laboratories, workshops, living quarters, animal breeding facilities, an airfield, and a crematorium. Security perimeters surrounded the entire compound. Maps omitted the site, and its existence was classified under military secrecy laws. Shirishi was appointed as commander of the new unit. He held the rank of lieutenant colonel at that time, and would later rise to major general. His organizational control was absolute. The research structure consisted of several divisions. Division 1, experimentation with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid. Division 2, weapons testing, including bombs designed for biological dispersal. Division 3, waterborne pathogen research. Division 4, production of bacterial cultures for a field deployment. Division 5, training and medical administration. Recruitment was handled internally by the Army. Personnel were sworn to secrecy under penalty of execution for disclosure. The Japanese government referred to all activities as epidemic prevention work. No civilian oversight existed. By late 1936, Unit 731 was operational. Reports sent to Tokyo listed research into water sterilization and disease control. Unofficially, human experimentation had begun. The early experiments focused on frostbite, dehydration, and transfusion limits. Prisoners were exposed to extreme cold to observe tissue necrosis. Others were deliberately infected with bacteria to measure disease progression. All subjects were executed after testing, usually by vivisection without anesthesia. The data were recorded and sent to the Central Army Medical School for analysis. The information remained internal to the Japanese military. No public or foreign awareness existed. Ishii's team referred to their work as Shokubai Jiken, material experiments. By 1937, Unit 731 employed more than 1,500 personnel and operated additional subunits across occupied China. That same year, Japan escalated the conflict into full-scale war with China following the Marco Polo Bridge incident. The expansion of hostilities provided Ishii with an endless supply of prisoners and an unrestricted testing environment. By the end of 1936, the foundation was complete: a command center at Pingfang, trained staff, a secure perimeter, and official recognition by the Imperial Japanese Army. Unit 731 now functioned as the core of Japan's biological warfare program, one that would continue without interruption until 1945. By 1937, Unit 731 had evolved into a complete scientific military complex with its own internal system, command structure, and classified divisions. The core of its work centered on bacteriological research. Scientists were tasked with cultivating and weaponizing living pathogens for potential use in warfare. Within the sterile walls of Pingfang, researchers grew cultures of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague, Vibrio cholerae for cholera, Bacillus anthracis for anthrax, and Salmonella typhi for typhoid fever. These pathogens were raised in controlled environments, fed through nutrient solutions, and transferred between glass containers under strict temperature regulation. The goal was to produce bacterial strains strong enough to survive air dispersal, bomb explosions, and environmental exposure, while remaining virulent once inside the human body. Parallel to the bacteriological research, a second division operated under the name of experimental medicine. This branch conducted invasive studies on both humans and animals to observe how infection affected the body. The victims, Chinese civilians, prisoners of war, and at times Russian captives, were infected deliberately with bacteria through injections or ingestion of contaminated material. The scientists monitored symptoms daily, recording the rate of fever, swelling, or organ failure until the subject died. Immediately after death, the body was dissected. The dissections were performed without anesthesia, based on the belief that anesthetic chemicals could interfere with laboratory accuracy. The purpose, recorded in reports later found by Allied investigators, was to trace how disease progressed through each organ and to identify which pathogens produced the fastest or most lethal reactions. Inside the same compound, another group of engineers worked on turning these findings into practical weapons. They designed delivery mechanisms capable of spreading bacterial agents across large areas. One such invention was a porcelain bomb, a thin-walled spherical shell that could shatter upon impact and release plague-infected fleas or aerosolized pathogens. These bombs were tested repeatedly under field conditions in occupied territories of China, where villages were exposed to infected materials to study transmission patterns. The engineers also experimented with aerial sprayers and fragmentation devices capable of carrying liquid bacterial solutions. Each design was measured for dispersal range, survival of bacteria after detonation, and mortality rates in both animals and humans. Alongside these operations existed a section called water purification. Officially, its purpose was to ensure safe water for troops stationed in Manchuria. In reality, this department examined how wells, rivers, and city water systems could become vehicles for epidemic outbreaks. The team studied how long pathogens survived in cold or stagnant water, and what quantities were required to contaminate entire reservoirs. Their findings, though presented as sanitation research, were used to prepare for biological sabotage against enemy populations. To support field operations, another branch focused on epidemiology. Teams were dispatched to sites of natural disease outbreaks in Manchuria and northern China to collect soil, water, and tissue samples. They studied plague-carrying rodents, the migration of fleas, and patterns of seasonal infection. Their data helped refine the Unit S understanding of how disease spread among humans and animals under real environmental conditions. These same teams later coordinated field trials, ensuring that experimental infections matched natural epidemics as closely as possible. Finally, the logistics and education departments ensured that Unit 731 functioned like a small, self-sufficient city. Personnel were trained in laboratory technique, dissection, and containment procedures. Supply chains were maintained for chemicals, glassware, medical instruments, and animals used in experiments. All materials were transported under military escort. Communications with other facilities were encoded, and every employee, from senior physician to janitor, signed a lifelong secrecy oath under threat of execution for disclosure. By 1938, the unit structure was complete. The laboratories produced bacterial cultures in quantities sufficient for military use. The animal facilities bred thousands of test subjects each year, and the crematorium disposed of remains daily. The division of labor was efficient, cold, and unquestioned. Every section contributed to a single objective: the creation of reliable biological weapons under the control of the Imperial Japanese Army. Outside the compound, the propaganda continued to describe the Pingfang complex as a medical sanitation center devoted to protecting troops from disease. Inside, the scientists worked in silence, recording results in precise handwriting, submitting reports coded as epidemic prevention data. The deception was total. None of the outside world yet understood that behind the white walls and surgical masks, Japan had built the most extensive human experimentation program in modern history. By the late 1930s, the region surrounding Harbin had grown quiet under occupation. The Japanese military controlled all of Manchuria, and the local population lived under strict surveillance. Curfews were enforced, trains were inspected, and farmers were questioned by soldiers who rarely explained their purpose. South of the city, near the railway junction of Pingfang, a complex of concrete buildings rose steadily from the frozen ground. To the nearby residents, it appeared to be another military depot or war hospital. No one was permitted to approach it, and those who asked questions disappeared. The compound had no name on official maps, only a number. Within Japanese military records, it was known simply as Unit 731. The facility operated as a closed world. Scientists and soldiers lived inside its walls, separated from the civilians of Manchukuo by barbed wire and military police. The staff followed precise routines. At dawn, the laboratories were sterilized with carbolic acid and steam. At mid-morning, technicians prepared cultures, while prisoners were moved from cells to examination rooms under guard. In the afternoon, autopsies and disinfections were carried out, and at night the crematorium burned waste materials under supervision. The smoke that rose each evening was dismissed by residents as ordinary factory exhaust. The prisoners who filled the cells came from every part of occupied China. Some were captured resistance members. Others were peasants taken from villages during counterinsurgency operations. The Kempeitai, Japan's military police, selected detainees for transfer to Pingfang without trial. Once inside, they were stripped of identity and recorded only by number. They were kept in isolation, fed minimal rations, and used according to the needs of the laboratory schedule. The experiments conducted during this period became increasingly systematic. Reports sent to Tokyo described progress in plague culture, anthrax spore production, and the refinement of bacteriological bombs. Within the facility, the tone of research remained clinical. Scientists documented symptoms and time of death as if conducting agricultural studies. Prisoners were infected with cholera and plague to measure virulence. Others were subjected to dehydration, pressure changes, or injected with blood from animals carrying disease. Many of these experiments were intended to determine which pathogens could be controlled for use in the field. During winters, another series of experiments studied the limits of the human body in extreme cold. Prisoners were taken outside into temperatures of -20 degrees Celsius, their arms or legs immersed in ice water until frozen solid. The researchers recorded how long it took for skin and muscle to die, and how different thawing methods, hot air, body heat, or fire affected survival. These frostbite experiments were later cited by Shi himself as valuable data for army medicine in northern climates. None of the subjects survived. In addition to biological and physiological tests, Unit 731 developed methods for disease distribution. Aircraft were used to drop plague-infected fleas contained in porcelain shells. Ground tests were performed in remote villages south of Harbin, where food and wells were deliberately contaminated. These operations were recorded as field sanitation studies. Their success was measured in infection rates among the local population. Entire villages were destroyed afterward to prevent discovery. Life for the personnel of Unit 731 followed military order, but carried an undercurrent of secrecy. Most soldiers assigned to guard duty were young and poorly educated. They were told only that the facility handled dangerous materials. Those who questioned orders were transferred or punished. The scientists, many from top Japanese universities, lived comfortably inside the compound, with housing, rations, and privileges unavailable to common soldiers. Within the community of researchers, moral questions rarely appeared in official documents. Later testimonies indicated that most considered their work an extension of war, justified by national duty. Outside the walls, The land gave no sign of what occurred within. The surrounding steppes stretched silent and endless, covered in snow for most of the year. The railway line that served Pingfang carried supplies and staff, but was closed to passengers. To outsiders, the facility seemed a sleeper cluster of quiet buildings lost in the northern cold. Yet behind the stillness, every day produced new data, new corpses, and new samples sealed for shipment to Tokyo. By 1939, Ishisha had consolidated his control. He now held the rank of Major General and answered only to the top command of the Kwantung Army. His project was considered a strategic success. Funding increased, and additional subunits were created across occupied China to expand biological testing. The main complex at Pingfang became the center of Japan's biological warfare network. It functioned with precision and silence. No one outside the military hierarchy knew its full scope. In that same year, the first documented large-scale production of pathogens occurred at the site. Records later recovered after the war indicated that Unit 731 could produce hundreds of kilograms of bacterial material monthly. Samples of plague, anthrax, and cholera were stored in sealed ampoules, labeled under agricultural research codes. The laboratory's air filtration and incineration systems were upgraded to prevent accidental leaks. Each staff member carried identification with color-coded clearance levels. By the time World War II erupted in Europe, Unit 731 had already been operating for over 3 years in secret. The staff had accumulated thousands of pages of experimental data and established standardized methods for infection and disposal. The Japanese government continued to deny the existence of biological warfare programs, even within military circles. The operations were confined entirely to Manchuria, away from international scrutiny. The quiet of the steppe hid everything: the laboratories, the bodies, the smoke, and the belief that what they were doing would never be known. Inside the compound, the work was steady, methodical, and absolute. Outside, the snow fell over the frozen fields of Manchuria, erasing footprints by morning. What remained was silence, an ordinary silence that concealed extraordinary crimes. By the beginning of the 1940s, Japan had expanded its war into China and Southeast Asia. The Kwantung Army in Manchuria remained the empire's most powerful ground force, controlling vast territories and resources. Within its command structure, Unit 731 operated as an independent branch, reporting only to high-ranking officers in Tokyo. The facility at Pingfang reached its peak capacity around this time, employing several thousand staff members and housing an estimated 500 to 1,000 prisoners at any given moment. The research had shifted from laboratory study to practical application. Ishisha believed that only field testing could provide accurate data for wartime use. To obtain this, he organized controlled biological attacks against human populations in areas of occupied China. The purpose was to study transmission, mortality, and containment. In internal military correspondence, these operations were called field sanitation experiments. The first confirmed operations occurred in 1940 in the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi. Airplanes from the Japanese army dropped ceramic bombs containing plague-infected fleas over several towns, including Ningbo and Changde. The fleas had been bred and infected at the Pingfang complex. The resulting outbreaks caused hundreds of civilian deaths. Local Chinese doctors recorded cases of sudden fever, swollen lymph nodes, and rapid death, consistent with bubonic plague. Japanese reports described the operations as successful large-scale field trials. In addition to plague, Ishi's teams tested cholera, typhoid, and anthrax. In 1941, outbreaks of cholera appeared in coastal provinces, following Japanese troop movements. Investigations conducted decades later by the International Committee of the Red Cross and Chinese authorities linked these to deliberate contamination of wells and rivers. Japanese field units under Ishi's direction distributed bacterial cultures disguised as medical supplies. The army documented the results with photographs and charts measuring infection spread by village and by week. Within Pingfang itself, the scale of experimentation increased. Prisoners were categorized according to the pathogen being tested. Infections were administered by injection, ingestion, or exposure to aerosols released into sealed chambers. The scientists measured incubation time, symptom progression, and lethality. After death, bodies were dissected, organs removed, and bacterial samples preserved for further study. Reports from post-war interrogations confirm that some subjects were infected simultaneously with multiple diseases to examine interactions. Parallel studies examine the effect of biological agents on the human immune system. Researchers injected animal blood into prisoners, conducted transfusions between species, and tested serum-based treatments on advanced infections. The stated goal was to develop vaccines for Japanese troops, though no evidence indicates that such research produced effective medicine. The experiments instead provided statistical records of suffering and death, recorded with laboratory precision. Frostbite research continued under the supervision of Dr. Hisato Yoshimura. Prisoners were exposed to freezing air until limbs became solid, then thawed under different conditions to determine the best method for preventing tissue loss in soldiers stationed in cold climates. The data collected from these experiments were later used in Japanese and, after the war, American medical research. At the same time, the engineering branch improved methods for biological delivery. Porcelain bombs of the type known as UG-50 were tested repeatedly. These bombs were designed to release plague-infected fleas or liquid bacterial suspensions upon impact. Records indicate that prototypes were tested at military proving grounds near Anda and Dunhua, both within Manchuria. Observers reported that plague vectors survived the explosions and spread effectively through surrounding areas. Unit 731 coordinated closely with other research groups. Unit 100, based in Changchun, investigated animal diseases and their potential as weapons against livestock. Unit 1644, located in Nanjing, carried out cholera and typhoid experiments, supplying data back to Pingfang. Unit 1855, near Beijing, cultivated bacterial stocks for transport. Together, these facilities formed an integrated system for the mass production of biological agents under military command. By 1942, the Japanese army had established an operational plan for using these weapons in large-scale warfare. Documents recovered after the war show that Ishii proposed the use of plague and cholera bombs against Soviet forces if Japan entered conflict with the USSR. Although this plan was never executed, the infrastructure for deployment existed. Aircraft from the Kwantung Army's air divisions were trained for biological missions, and maps of target zones were prepared. Inside the Pingfang compound, prisoners continued to be used for testing. Newly captured civilians arrived weekly from nearby prisons. They were registered, quarantined, and then transferred to the laboratories. Few survived longer than a month. The crematorium operated continuously, destroying remains and contaminated materials. The ashes were mixed with coal waste and buried outside the compound. All operations were documented meticulously. Reports were marked top secret and circulated among authorized officers and scientific advisors in Tokyo. The research data were labeled as epidemic prevention results and stored in locked archives. Japanese officers visiting the facility were shown selected experiments to demonstrate progress. No record shows any official objection within the military hierarchy. The outside world remained unaware. International medical organizations had no access to Manchuria, and Japanese wartime censorship blocked all information in the occupied territories. The research staff, Unit 731, continued to publish limited papers in Japanese medical journals under pseudonyms, describing their work as studies of disease prevention. None of these publications mentioned human subjects. By the end of 1942, Unit 731 had completed numerous field operations across China. The exact number of casualties remains uncertain, but estimates from Chinese and later Allied investigations suggest that tens of thousands of civilians were killed in plague, cholera, and anthrax outbreaks linked to these experiments. The Japanese military classified the results as strategically valuable. Within the compound, morale remained high among staff. The secrecy, funding, and military support gave researchers authority, rarely seen in wartime. Ishii held absolute power, his orders beyond question. Under his direction, the distinction between research and weapon production disappeared. By the close of 1942, Unit 731 was not merely a laboratory. It had become a fully functional biological weapons factory, operating under the guise of medical science. The fields around Pingfang stayed quiet through the winter. Trains came and went at night, carrying barrels sealed with wax and marked only with numerical codes. In official paperwork, they were shipments of water purification materials. In reality, they contained concentrated cultures of plague and cholera bound for military storage. The snow hid the tracks by morning. The world beyond the steppe knew nothing. By 1942, Japan's war in Asia had entered its most aggressive phase. The military occupied vast regions of China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Within this expanding front, Unit 731 and its satellite organizations continued their work without interference. Funding increased through direct allocation from the Imperial Army's medical budget. Orders from Tokyo described the program as essential to defensive epidemic prevention, a phrase that concealed the development and testing of biological weapons. The Pingfang complex had grown into an industrial-scale installation. It contained over 100 buildings, multiple laboratories, workshops, animal houses, and storage depots. A dedicated railway spur connected the facility to the main line between Harbin and Mudanjong. This infrastructure allowed for large-scale transport of equipment, supplies, and living test subjects. By 1943, Unit 731 could produce several hundred kilograms of bacterial material monthly, including cultures of plague, anthrax, typhoid, and paratyphoid bacteria. Ishii maintained full authority as commander. His direct subordinates oversaw specialized divisions handling bacteriology, pathology, engineering, and logistics. Research priorities were determined according to military demand. Reports from this period indicate that plague and cholera remained the principal focus, followed by anthrax and dysentery. The scientists refined cultivation techniques to increase bacterial stability under temperature and humidity changes, an essential step for aerial or artillery delivery. Field trials continued across occupied China. Teams from Pingfang were dispatched under military escort to areas selected for experimentation. In Zhejiang and Hunan provinces, plague-infected fleas were again dropped from aircraft onto civilian populations. Additional tests used liquid cholera cultures to contaminate rivers and wells. Japanese military units monitored infection rates and reported back to Harbin. Internal memoranda described the results in quantitative terms: percentage of infection, time to onset, and overall mortality. The wording remains scientific, detached from the human cost. These operations coincided with Japanese counterinsurgency campaigns. Biological warfare was used as an auxiliary tactic against Chinese guerrilla forces and villages suspected of supporting them. The outbreaks that followed were severe, often spreading beyond the target zones. Records from Chinese and Western medical sources documented epidemics that killed tens of thousands of civilians between 1940 and 1943. The Japanese army classified the results as effective field verification. Within the walls of Unit 731, laboratory testing continued without interruption. Prisoners were deliberately infected to compare virulence between strains and to test potential vaccines. Ishii encouraged competition among researchers to produce data suitable for military presentation. Each experiment followed the same routine: infection, observation, dissection, and recording. The results were filed under coded categories, identified by number rather than by subject. According to post-war testimony, the researchers avoided direct references to human beings, referring instead to materials or specimens. By 1944, the program's logistical reach extended far beyond Manchuria. Subunits attached to field armies in southern China and Southeast Asia were supplied with bacterial agents from Pingfang. Unit 1644 in Nanjing specialized in large-scale cholera production, while Unit 1855 near Beijing handled plague culture. Both maintained constant correspondence with Ishi's headquarters. In some cases, the pathogens produced at these sites were shipped to other research installations under refrigeration, packed in ceramic containers, sealed with wax. The engineering division at Pingfang developed additional weapon prototypes. Among these were the UG bomb series, designed to disperse plague-infected fleas, and fragmentation bombs filled with anthrax spores. Experimental tests were conducted at military proving grounds under controlled conditions. These tests measured dispersal radius, bacterial survival after explosion, and infection efficiency. Surviving records indicate that by 1944, the Japanese army had the capacity to deploy biological weapons on a tactical scale. Plans were drafted for broader use. In 1944, as Japan faced increasing pressure from Allied forces, Ishii proposed launching plague attacks against the Soviet Union in the event of war on that front. He also advocated the possibility of using biological weapons against the United States through submarine operations. These proposals were never implemented, likely due to logistical challenges and fear of retaliation. Nevertheless, the readiness for such attacks demonstrates the scale of the project's ambition. Inside the compound, the prisoners' conditions deteriorated as the war turned against Japan. Food shortages and disease became common even among staff, yet the experiments continued. Newly captured civilians were still transported to Pingfang by train from local prisons. Many were used for infection testing, others for weapon effect trials. Some were tied to stakes outdoors, while bombs filled with bacteria were detonated nearby. Observers documented distance, temperature, and survival time. The findings were recorded as weapon efficiency data. As Japan began to lose control of its territories in 1945, Ishii ordered accelerated production and data consolidation. Laboratories worked around the clock. Samples of plague and cholera were preserved for shipment to Tokyo. In early August 1945, when Soviet forces invaded Manchuria, Unit 731 was still fully operational. Ishii received orders to evacuate. He instructed his staff to destroy all evidence of experimentation. Prisoners were executed, remaining facilities were dynamited, and documents were burned. Tanks of bacterial cultures were drained and buried. The retreat was carried out in haste. When Soviet troops reached Pingfang in mid-August 1945, they found the compound largely destroyed. Burned remains, scattered instruments, and fragments of medical records were recovered. The Soviets collected testimony from captured Japanese personnel, confirming the scale of human experimentation and biological warfare research. Later that year, Ishii was captured by American forces but never prosecuted. Between 1942 and 1945, Unit 731 and its affiliated organizations conducted the largest and most systematic biological warfare program of the Second World War. Their operations resulted in multiple outbreaks of plague, cholera, and other diseases across China, killing tens of thousands of civilians. The exact number remains unknown due to the destruction of records. The program's leadership survived the war, protected by the secrecy of post-war intelligence negotiations. In the quiet years that followed, the snow returned to cover the ruins of Pingfang. The laboratory buildings collapsed into dust, and the train tracks rusted in the cold. The official records had vanished, but the traces remained in testimony, in medical archives, and in the memories of survivors who lived through the epidemics. For the world outside, the truth would not surface until decades later, when fragments of reports and confessions revealed what had been hidden behind the language of science. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, the Kwantung Army was caught unprepared. Within days, Soviet forces crossed the borders of Manchuria, advancing rapidly toward Harbin and the surrounding region. At that moment, Unit 731 was still fully operational. Its laboratories were stocked with live cultures of plague, anthrax, and cholera. Hundreds of prisoners remained in detention. Equipment, records, and unfinished experiments filled the complex. Shirashi, still commanding the facility, convened emergency meetings with his senior staff. The orders he gave in those final days ensured that almost all physical evidence of a decade of experimentation would disappear. The first directive was to eliminate every living test subject. Guards and medical staff executed the prisoners by poison, gunfire, or injection. Their bodies were burned in the crematorium or buried in shallow pits inside the compound. At the same time, soldiers destroyed laboratories with explosives, poured gasoline over bacterial cultures, and set fire to archives. Barrels of plague and cholera agents were emptied into drainage ditches and covered with lime and soil. Animal cages were opened, releasing thousands of infected rats and fleas into the surrounding steppe. The retreat was systematic, following a checklist prepared in advance for the contingency of invasion. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Communications between Tokyo and Manchuria collapsed almost immediately. Ishii received authorization to disband his unit and withdraw toward Korea and Japan. Before departure, he instructed his subordinates to maintain silence about all activities at Pingfang. They were ordered to destroy their uniforms, conceal their identities, and report to new military hospitals under assumed roles. Most of the staff obeyed. Over the following weeks, trains carried personnel and remaining equipment south, disguised as medical transports. When Soviet troops reached the outskirts of Harbin later that month, they found the compound in ruins. The buildings had been blown up. The airfield was cratered. The laboratories were charred, yet traces of the work remained. Soviet investigators discovered surgical instruments, glass containers labeled with bacterial names, and fragments of documents bearing the seal of the Kwantung Army's Epidemic Prevention Department. In surrounding villages, residents described strange illnesses and sudden deaths that had occurred after the Japanese retreat. The Soviets secured the site, collected samples from the soil and nearby water sources, and began interrogating captured Japanese officers. Among those taken into custody were several members of Unit 731 staff who had failed to escape. Their testimonies provided the first detailed evidence of organized biological warfare by Japan. Soviet intelligence transferred the detainees to Khabarovsk, where they were held for later trial. Meanwhile, American forces occupying Japan began their own investigations. In late 1945, U.S. military intelligence officers questioned former members of the Japanese Army Medical School and requested information on epidemic prevention research conducted in Manchuria. Ishii himself was located by U.S. authorities in 1946. Rather than being arrested, he was quietly placed under protection. The American occupation government, led by General Douglas MacArthur, sought exclusive access to Japanese biological warfare data. Negotiations began between U.S. intelligence officers and former members of Unit 731, including Ishii and his deputy Masaji Kitano. In exchange for complete research reports and cooperation, the scientists were granted immunity from prosecution. This arrangement was approved at the highest levels of the U.S. Occupation Command. The justification was that the information held by the Japanese researchers could advance American knowledge of biological and chemical warfare during the emerging Cold War. While the Americans secured the cooperation of Ishii's team, the Soviets proceeded with their own legal process. In December 1949, The Soviet military convened the Khabarovsk war crimes trial. 12 former members of Unit 731, unrelated units, were charged with developing and employing bacteriological weapons. The proceedings lasted 9 days. Detailed confessions described human experimentation, field testing, and the use of plague and cholera against civilian populations. The court sentenced the defendants to prison terms ranging from 2 to 25 years. Ishii was not among them. By then he was living under American protection in Japan. The records from the Khabarovsk trial were published in 1950, but dismissed by Western governments as Soviet propaganda. The United States suppressed its own reports concerning the immunity agreements. For decades, the activities of Unit 731 remained largely unknown outside limited intelligence circles. Many of its former members resumed professional careers in post-war Japan. Several became professors at medical universities, directors of pharmaceutical companies, and officials in the Ministry of Health. Their past affiliations were omitted from official biographies. By the end of 1945, the physical structure of Unit 731 no longer existed. The buildings at Pingfang were dismantled for scrap by local residents, the runways overgrown with weeds. Yet within archives in Washington, Moscow, and Tokyo, fragments of the project's records remained, coded reports, bacterial charts, and correspondence stamped secret. The governments that possessed them withheld disclosure for reasons of national interest. For survivors in China, and for the families of those who perished, no acknowledgement or compensation was provided. The collapse of Unit 731 marked not only the end of a facility, but the beginning of a long silence. The destruction of evidence and the subsequent political agreements ensured that much of the truth would remain hidden for decades. What had begun as an experimental branch of the Kwantung Army had become, by war's end, an example of how science could be turned completely toward destruction and how power could protect those who served it. When the Second World War ended in August 1945, Japan stood in ruins. Cities lay flattened, the military dissolved, and millions of soldiers returned home to a country stripped of empire. Yet among the returning officers were men whose wartime records were never officially written. They came not from battlefields, but from laboratories, scientists and doctors of the Imperial Army's Biological Warfare Division, the group once known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, or more precisely, Unit 731. In the months following surrender, their paths diverged, but their silence was uniform. Ishii, who had directed the program for nearly a decade, disappeared from official records. Some reports claim he hid in the mountains of Nagano Prefecture under an assumed name. Others suggest he was sheltered by former military contacts within the American occupation's public health offices. Regardless of location, by early 1946 he had re-emerged quietly, living under US supervision and cooperating with American intelligence. His rank had been erased from Japanese archives, but his knowledge, the results of thousands of experiments, was suddenly valuable. The Americans, preparing for a new era of geopolitical rivalry with the Soviet Union, quickly realized the significance of the data Ishii and his colleagues possessed. The United States had its own biological research programs, yet its scientists lacked direct data on human exposure to infectious diseases under controlled conditions. What Ishii offered was a complete body of material, experimental records covering plague, cholera, anthrax, frostbite, dehydration, and the physiology of extreme suffering, all collected with brutal precision. By late 1945, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, led by General Douglas MacArthur, began discreet discussions with Japanese scientists associated with wartime medical programs. Officers from the US Army's Chemical Corps and the Technical Intelligence Units were sent to Japan to identify individuals connected to epidemic prevention research. Among those interviewed were Major General Masaji Kitano, Ishii's deputy, Colonel Ryoichi Nato, head of logistics, and several former professors from Kyoto and Tokyo Imperial Universities. Each offered partial information in exchange for protection. Officially, war crimes investigations were underway across Asia. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE, had been established to try Japan's leaders. Yet within the tribunal's thousands of pages of indictments, no mention was made of biological warfare. The subject remained classified. Evidence collected by Soviet and Chinese investigators was excluded from Allied proceedings. The absence of documentation from American archives ensured that the experiments of Unit 731 were never entered into the record. During this period, the surviving data from Pingfang and its satellite units were systematically collected. Ishi's subordinates, including Kitano and NATO, organized surviving reports into a coherent archive. These documents were delivered to U.S. occupation authorities at the American-run Camp Detrick Biological Warfare Center, located in Maryland. The transfer occurred through intermediaries, primarily the U.S. Army's G2 intelligence branch. In return, immunity from prosecution was granted to all personnel involved. No formal treaty or written agreement was issued, but memoranda within the U.S. War Department later confirmed the arrangement. The data were categorized under Japanese Biological Warfare Research (JBWR) and restricted for use by American defense agencies. Scientists from Fort Detrick reviewed the material between 1946 and 1947, concluding that while the methods were unethical, the information held potential military value. It was integrated into classified studies on disease weaponization and human resilience. No evidence suggests that any of the Japanese researchers were asked to testify in open court. Their wartime activities were erased from public record. Meanwhile, in Japan, reconstruction began. Former members of Unit 731 reintegrated into civilian life. Many found employment in hospitals, universities, and pharmaceutical companies. Ryoichi Nato founded the Green Cross Corporation, which became one of Japan's largest medical manufacturers. Masaji Kitano returned to research and later held administrative posts in public health institutions. Their colleagues established academic careers, teaching new generations of doctors without mention of their wartime past. Government files referring to Unit 731 were sealed or destroyed. In China, local investigators surveyed the ruins at Pingfang. They recovered fragments of laboratory equipment, surgical instruments, and records partially burned but still legible. Witnesses from nearby villages testified about outbreaks of plague and cholera that had followed Japanese retreats. Their reports were submitted to Soviet authorities, forming part of the evidence used in the Khabarovsk trials of 1949. Yet these findings remained largely unknown. Outside the Eastern Bloc, Western newspapers dismissed the Soviet trials as political propaganda. The documents were never translated into English until decades later. During the immediate post-war years, American occupation censorship further suppressed discussion of Japan's wartime atrocities. Articles referencing biological warfare were prohibited from publication in Japanese newspapers. Even survivors of the epidemics in China, who attempted to send petitions to Allied authorities, received no response. The narrative of Japan's surrender and reconstruction moved forward without reference to Unit 731 or its victims. By 1947, Ishii had effectively retired from public life. He reportedly served as an advisor to the U.S. Army on matters related to biological defense, though his name appeared in no official capacity. He lived quietly in Tokyo until his death in 1959, never tried or charged with war crimes. His subordinates followed similar paths. Some emigrated. Others became senior figures in Japan's scientific community. None faced legal consequences for their actions. The cover-up was nearly complete. The Soviet Union held its own archives. The United States possessed the original data. Japan rebuilt itself under occupation, and the victims of Manchuria's experiments were left without recognition or justice. Only a handful of documents survived in Chinese and Soviet custody to testify to what had occurred. For the rest of the world, the story of Unit 731 vanished into classified files labeled simply epidemic research. The years immediately after 1945 were marked by silence, deliberate and thorough. Governments that might have exposed the crimes instead concealed them, believing the information obtained outweighed the moral cost. The people who had created and carried out the experiments resumed lives of respectability. Their findings became footnotes in scientific literature, stripped of origin and context. What had once been the machinery of death at Pingfang dissolved into the normalcy of post-war peace. Its records sealed, its history unwritten, its legacy buried beneath the politics of the Cold War. In the decade following Japan's surrender, the memory of Unit 731 almost completely disappeared from public awareness. Within occupied Japan, the American-led administration emphasized reconstruction and stability. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal concluded in 1948 without a single charge related to biological warfare. The Soviet Khabarovsk proceedings, which had documented testimonies from Japanese scientists, were ignored in the West. In official histories published during the occupation, the story of the war in Manchuria ended with the Soviet invasion. No mention was made of Pingfang or the epidemic prevention units. The silence was political and deliberate. For the United States, biological and chemical warfare had become matters of strategic priority. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 and the escalation of tensions with the Soviet Union shifted intelligence priorities. The U.S. Army's biological warfare laboratories at Fort Detrick, Maryland, sought to expand their understanding of disease as a weapon. Data obtained from Japanese scientists through post-war agreements were classified under the heading Japanese medical experiments. These included studies of plague, cholera, typhoid, frostbite, and dehydration, all based on human experimentation conducted in Manchuria. Internal memoranda from 1951 and 1950 to show that American analysts regarded the information as unique because it represented data not obtainable in our own laboratories. The names of Unit 731 personnel were redacted, and the material was integrated into Cold War research. Several former members of Ishii's staff were consulted informally by American military medical researchers during the early 1950s. Though their participation was not acknowledged publicly, records declassified decades later confirm that both Ishii and his deputy, Masaji Kitano, provided technical advice on bacteriological defense measures. Ishii himself avoided public attention and lived quietly in Tokyo until his death in 1959. Kitano and others continued their medical careers. None of them faced legal scrutiny. In Japan, the government and academia moved forward under policies that avoided confronting wartime crimes. Universities that had supplied personnel to Unit 731, such as Kyoto Imperial University, Tokyo Imperial University, and Keio Medical School, reinstated or promoted their former staff. Some of these professors wrote textbooks, served as deans, and trained post-war generations of doctors. Official records omitted their wartime assignments. By the mid-1950s, individuals who had once overseen human experimentation were now leading Japan's post-war medical modernization. The pharmaceutical industry also benefited. Former officers of Unit 731 founded or joined major corporations, including the Green Cross Corporation, which became a key producer of vaccines and blood products in Japan. These companies expanded rapidly during the economic recovery. No public record connected their founders to biological warfare research. Their success was regarded as part of Japan's transformation from empire to industrial democracy. Meanwhile, the Cold War deepened. The Soviet Union continued to publicize the Khabarovsk trial transcripts, distributing them through Eastern Bloc media as evidence of Western hypocrisy. The United States dismissed these documents as propaganda. Western newspapers rarely mentioned them. As a result, the story of Unit 731 became a Cold War casualty acknowledged in secret, denied in public. In China, however, the memory persisted. Survivors from villages affected by plague and cholera outbreaks continued to report their experiences. Local officials recorded testimonies describing Japanese airplanes dropping strange objects and soldiers distributing contaminated food. These reports were collected by Chinese war crimes investigators in the early 1950s and presented at international meetings, but they attracted little attention outside the socialist bloc. Western historians, reliant on Allied records, found no corroborating documents in Tokyo or Washington and therefore regarded the allegations as unverified. By the late 1950s, most physical traces of Unit 731 had vanished. The site at Pingfang had been dismantled, its materials reused for civilian construction. Soviet investigators had removed much of the remaining equipment to laboratories in Khabarovsk. The grounds were overgrown and unmarked. In Japan, the government retained no accessible files related to the biological warfare program. The occupation authorities had closed their archives, and the new Japanese constitution limited inquiries into wartime military matters. Inside Japan, a culture of reticence grew around the subject. The collective narrative of post-war reconstruction emphasized victimhood, the atomic bombings, the devastation of cities, and the suffering of ordinary citizens. Few wished to revisit Japan's role as a perpetrator. The atrocities of the Kwantung Army, including Unit 731, did not fit this national story. The silence persisted through textbooks, journalism, and film. The crimes of Manchuria became a topic absent from education for an entire generation. At the same time, the scientific data from Unit 731 remained valuable to both superpowers. The US military integrated Japanese material to its biological defense programs, and Soviet laboratories used the Khabarovsk evidence to develop countermeasures and offensive capabilities. Both nations, though adversaries, shared one unspoken agreement: the experiments in Manchuria were too useful to condemn. By the early 1960s, the surviving members of the former unit were aging into senior positions. Their contributions to Japanese medicine, unconnected to their past, earned them professional recognition. Publicly, none of them ever discussed the human cost of their wartime work. Ishi's name appeared only in confidential American reports until the 1980s, when journalists rediscovered his role. Throughout these decades, the victims remained nameless. No memorials were built, no compensation offered, no official acknowledgement made. The only consistent witnesses were the people in northern China who remembered the epidemics and the soldiers who had guarded the compound in Manchuria. The world, preoccupied with nuclear competition and ideological struggle, left their voices unheard. By the end of the 1960s, the story of Unit 731 had effectively merged with the Cold War's hidden history, a past preserved in classified files, scientific archives, and the memories of those who had been ordered to forget. The silence that began in 1945 had become institutional, woven into the post-war order itself. What had been erased by war was now maintained by peace. Public awareness of Unit 731 began to reappear in Japan and abroad during the 1970s, more than 25 years after the end of the war. The first factual mentions came from independent journalists, retired military personnel, and a small number of researchers who gained access to previously sealed archives. Until that point, no official Japanese document, academic paper, or government statement had acknowledged the existence of the unit. In 1971, Japanese writer and journalist Seiichi Morimura began investigating wartime atrocities in Manchuria. Over several years, he interviewed former soldiers, medical workers, and residents of Harbin. His work culminated in a serialized publication titled Akuma no Hoshoku, The Devil's Feast, first appearing in 1981 in the Shuriken Bunchen magazine. The series, based on verified testimonies, introduced the term Unit 731 to a wide Japanese audience for the first time. It described experiments, biological warfare tests, and the destruction of evidence during Japan's surrender. Although the series met resistance from conservative media, it was later compiled into books that sold widely across Japan. Simultaneously, historians outside Japan began uncovering supporting material. In 1979, documents from U.S. military archives were declassified under the Freedom of Information Act. These included correspondence between General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters and American intelligence officers confirming that former Unit 731 personnel had been granted immunity in exchange for their research data. The released files listed names of several scientists, summaries of their experiments, and technical evaluations by the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. The information confirmed that the American government had known of the atrocities and had incorporated the data into its biological defense programs. In the Soviet Union, the transcripts of the 1949 Khabarovsk war crimes trial were reprinted in academic journals and used in medical ethics discussions. Western researchers who reviewed these translations found that the testimonies of Japanese defendants matched the newly declassified American materials. Together, they established a consistent factual record that Japan had operated large-scale human experimentation and biological warfare programs between 1936 and 1945. During the late 1970s, Chinese historians and government institutions began documenting evidence from Manchuria. The Chinese Academy of Sciences and the Harbin municipal government conducted excavations at the former Pingfang site. Between 1979 and 1980, teams uncovered fragments of surgical instruments, bottles labeled with medical terms in Japanese, and human remains consistent with autopsy procedures. Photographs and reports from these excavations were presented at international academic conferences in Beijing and Moscow. In Japan, responses remained divided. The Ministry of Education did not alter official school textbooks to include references to Unit 731. Right-wing political groups denied the validity of Morimura's accounts, arguing they relied on anecdotal evidence. However, independent verification continued. In 1982, a group of Japanese citizens, journalists, and historians established the Association for the Discovery of War Responsibility, which began collecting oral testimonies from former members of the Imperial Army. Several individuals, including former guards and technicians, confirmed the unit's activities and described conditions inside the Pingfang compound. By 1984, the Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun published a series of investigative articles detailing the structure and leadership of Unit 731 based on testimonies, declassified Allied documents, and Soviet trial records. The articles named Shirashi, Masaji Kitano, and Ryoichi Nato as principal figures. This marked the first time Japanese media had reported the topic as established fact rather than speculation. Internationally, scholars such as Sheldon H. Harris, Peter Williams, and David Wallace conducted systematic studies using primary sources from American, Soviet, and Chinese archives. Their research, published in the 1980s, confirmed the technical scope of Japan's biological warfare program. They established that Unit 731 was one of several units forming an integrated military system, and that the research data had been transferred to the United States after the war. In 1985, the Chinese government opened a small exhibition on the site of the former Pingfang compound. The Harbin War Crime Evidence Museum displayed artifacts recovered during excavations, including surgical tables, restraint devices, and laboratory equipment. It also presented photographs of villages affected by plague and cholera outbreaks. The museum was later expanded and officially renamed the Unit 731 Museum. By the end of the 1980s, factual recognition of Unit 731 had entered both academic and public discourse. The Japanese government maintained no official position, but references began to appear in some university-level history textbooks. International research institutions accepted the events as historically verified. Multiple independent sources from Allied intelligence reports, Soviet trial transcripts, Chinese archaeological findings, and Japanese eyewitness accounts converged to confirm that the Imperial Japanese Army had operated a biological warfare research and experimentation program in Manchuria. The emergence of these facts marked a turning point. After decades of denial and secrecy, Unit 731 transitioned from rumor to documented history. Yet despite growing evidence, neither the Japanese state nor the governments that had concealed post-war agreements issued formal acknowledgement or apology. The story had surfaced, but accountability remained absent. By the early 1990s, evidence surrounding Unit 731 had become widely accepted within the academic community, though public acknowledgement in Japan remained limited. The end of the Cold War and the gradual opening of archives in the United States, Russia, and China allowed researchers to access previously classified material. These documents confirmed the existence of the Japanese biological warfare program, the destruction of evidence at the end of the war, and the post-war immunity agreements between U.S. authorities and former Unit 731 personnel. In 1993, the United States National Archives released a collection of declassified files known as the Ishii Papers. These included reports from the U.S. Army's Technical Intelligence Division summarizing the interrogation of Japanese scientists between 1945 and 1947. The reports described experimental methods, the scale of the facilities at Pingfang, and the diseases studied. They also confirmed that American intelligence officers considered the data scientifically valuable. The release of these records eliminated remaining doubts in Western scholarship about the factual existence of Unit 731 and its experiments. In Japan, the 1990s marked the beginning of organized civic movements demanding recognition and accountability. Survivor groups in China, supported by Japanese human rights lawyers, filed lawsuits in Tokyo District Court, seeking official apology and compensation from the Japanese government. The first case, filed in 1997, was led by Chinese plaintiffs who had survived plague outbreaks in Zhejiang province during the war. They presented documentary evidence linking the epidemics to Japanese aerial dispersal of infected fleas. Japanese courts acknowledged the existence of the experiments, but rejected the claims for state compensation, citing the expiration of the government's wartime liability under international treaties. Public awareness in Japan increased during this period due to media coverage and documentaries. In 1998, the national broadcaster NHK aired a program titled The Truth about Unit 731, which included interviews with former members who admitted participation in human experiments. The broadcast generated widespread attention, but also controversy. Some political figures accused the network of defaming the nation, while others praised it for confronting a suppressed part of history. Academic research also advanced. Historian Sheldon H. Harris published Factories of Death, Japanese Biological Warfare, 1932 to 1945, and the American Cover-Up in 1994, using declassified US and Soviet materials to establish the chronology of Unit 731's operations and the post-war immunity deal. The book's conclusions, particularly the involvement of US authorities in protecting Ishii and his colleagues, were supported by additional documents released during the decade. China expanded its historical investigations as well. In 1997, excavation at the Pingfang site uncovered further remains, including glass ampoules containing bacterial residue and surgical fragments. These findings were analyzed by the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences and presented at international medical ethics conferences. The museum in Harbin was renovated and designated a national site of remembrance. It displayed original documents, photographs, and personal items of former victims. In 2002, the Tokyo District Court ruled on one of the major lawsuits brought by Chinese survivors. The court confirmed for the first time in an official Japanese judicial decision that Unit 731 had conducted human experimentation and biological warfare. However, the judgment also declared that individuals could not claim compensation directly from the Japanese government because of existing international legal settlements. The ruling was significant in acknowledging historical fact, though it denied legal redress. By the early 2000s, the subject entered Japanese public education at a limited level. Some regional school boards approved textbooks that mentioned Unit 731, while others avoided the topic to prevent controversy. University courses in modern history began including research on the biological warfare program as part of Japan's wartime record. Internationally, the issue continued to receive attention. The United Nations Subcommission on Human Rights included reference to Japan's wartime biological experiments in a 1999 report on crimes against humanity. Academic conferences in the United States, China, and Europe examined Unit 731 as a case study in medical ethics. The subject was increasingly compared with Nazi Germany's concentration camp experiments. Despite this growing acknowledgement, the Japanese government maintained its position of non-liability. Successive administrations expressed deep remorse for wartime suffering in general terms, but refrained from issuing a specific apology or compensation related to Unit 731. Diplomatic relations with China improved during this period, but historical disputes including the issue of biological warfare remained politically sensitive. By 2005, nearly all surviving members of Unit 731 were elderly or deceased. Interviews conducted by Japanese journalists in the 1990s and early 2000s recorded several confessions and personal accounts. These testimonies, preserved in written and audio-visual form, became crucial historical evidence. They described experimental procedures, the internal hierarchy of the unit, and the destruction of data at the end of the war. The combined weight of declassified documents, archaeological evidence, survivor testimony, and official court recognition established Unit 731 as a fully verified historical event. What had once been denied or obscured was now documented in multiple independent sources. The period of secrecy had ended, replaced by gradual acknowledgement in public discourse. Yet legal accountability and state-level apology remained unresolved. By the close of the early 21st century, Unit 731 was recognized by historians as one of the largest programs of human experimentation in modern history. Its factual existence was no longer debated. What persisted was the question of how societies, both those that committed and those that concealed such acts, should remember them. Today, the story of Unit 731 stands as one of the most thoroughly documented cases of human experimentation and biological warfare in modern history. Its existence is supported by military archives from Japan, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, by the testimonies of surviving personnel, by physical remains uncovered at Pingfang, and by the decisions of multiple courts recognizing the crimes as fact. The evidence is no longer disputed among historians. What remains unresolved is the question of moral and political responsibility. The unit's creation in the 1930s reflected the mindset of empire and total war. Its operations continued through the 1940s under a system that valued military utility over human life. The researchers considered themselves scientists serving their nation. Their work was conducted not in secrecy from their superiors, but with full institutional approval. The same administrative order that built railways and hospitals also constructed laboratories for vivisection and plague cultivation. The violence of Unit 731 was bureaucratic, methodical, and disguised by the language of science. At the end of the war, the destruction of records and the post-war immunity agreements concealed the truth for decades. The Cold War transformed the results of the experiments into strategic data. Governments that might have pursued justice instead preserved silence. The US decision to shield Shisha and his colleagues, the Soviet use of captured data for its own programs, and Japan's post-war avoidance of legal responsibility combined to protect those who had overseen mass murder in laboratories. The victims were left without names, graves, or acknowledgement. Gradually, the fragments of truth reemerged through journalism, declassified archives, survivor testimony, and historical research. By the early 21st century, Unit 731 had entered global historical memory as a factual event comparable in magnitude and moral consequence to the medical crimes of Nazi Germany. Its existence serves as evidence of how easily scientific ambition can be redirected into atrocity when detached from ethical restraint. In China, the site at Pingfang functions today as the Harbin Unit 731 Museum. It preserves artifacts recovered from the compound, surgical tables, autopsy tools, and fragments of documents written in Japanese military code. Visitors include scholars, students, and descendants of victims. Exhibits present the history in chronological order, supported by primary sources. The museum stands not as an accusation, but as documentation, a record of what was done in the name of progress and empire. In Japan, discussion of Unit 731 remains cautious. Academic research continues, and some local museums have mounted exhibitions, yet the subject is still absent from most national school curricula. The government's official position acknowledges civilian suffering in Asia, but does not name the specific units responsible. The gap between factual recognition and official acceptance persists. Internationally, the story of Unit 731 has influenced the development of modern research ethics. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947, was not applied to Japan at the time, but later revisions of medical and scientific ethical standards referenced both German and Japanese wartime experiments as precedents for regulation. Modern codes of medical conduct, informed consent, and human rights in experimentation trace part of their origin to the lessons drawn from these events. The legacy of Unit 731 is therefore dual. It is both a historical fact and a moral warning. It demonstrates that scientific knowledge is not inherently benevolent. It reflects the values of those who use it. The laboratories of Pingfang were not built by uneducated soldiers, but by trained doctors and researchers who chose obedience over conscience. Their example remains a caution to every system that grants absolute authority to science without ethical oversight. More than 80 years after its founding, Unit 731 remains a subject of ongoing research. Newly discovered documents continue to clarify details of its organization and scope. The survivors of infected villages have largely passed away, but their testimonies survive in archives and museums. Each fragment adds to a fuller understanding of how the machinery of war once turned laboratories into instruments of death. The truth, once buried under snow and secrecy, now exists in public record. The challenge is preservation, ensuring that the facts remain known after the last witnesses are gone. History's silence can be broken, but only if it is maintained through evidence, education, and memory. The story of Unit 731 endures as a factual reminder that progress without humanity is destruction, and that knowledge, when divorced from morality, becomes a weapon no less lethal than any made of steel.